The Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 was the largest world fair in American history to that point, covering 1,200 acres of Forest Park in St. Louis and attracting nearly 20 million visitors over its 7-month run. It was an event conceived on a scale that required its own language. The fairgrounds were larger than the entire city of Washington, D.C. inside the original plan. The main festival hall could seat 10,000 people simultaneously, and the construction workforce at peak employed somewhere above 10,000 men and women whose labor prepared the ground, raised the exhibition buildings, dug the waterways, and laid the infrastructure of a temporary city that would, for one summer and autumn, be the largest planned human settlement in the middle of the North American continent. The scale mattered because scale produces record-keeping problems, and record-keeping problems produce the conditions under which things get built, and used, and sealed, and forgotten, and eventually found again by people with no context for what they are finding. The fair construction began in earnest in 1902, and continued in accelerating phases through the spring of 1904, when the exposition opened in late April. Forest Park had not been empty before the fair. It had been a public park since the 1870s, with established paths, formal gardens, and the remnants of several smaller structures from earlier uses of the land. The construction crews encountered, in the course of their excavation work, a geology that was more complicated than the flat parkland surface suggested. St. Louis sits on a bluff above the Mississippi, and the limestone bedrock underlying the city and its surrounding land is riddled with the dissolution features characteristic of karst terrain, caves, sinkholes, underground channels where water moves through soluble rock in ways that do not announce themselves on the surface. The crews encountered these features regularly during the foundation work for the fair's largest structures and addressed them in the standard way, which was to fill them with rubble and concrete and proceed. The geological surveys conducted in advance of construction were adequate for a city context and inadequate for the depth and complexity of what lay beneath Forest Park. And the discrepancy between what was expected and what was found was managed through a combination of engineering improvisation and administrative silence. The main construction supervisor for the Fair Core exhibition area was a civil engineer named Frederick Wainscott, who had previously managed large infrastructure projects in Chicago and Kansas City, and who kept meticulous daily logs of construction progress, materials consumed, workforce assignments, and problems encountered. These logs were donated to the Missouri Historical Society following the fair conclusion, and they exist there now in 23 bound volumes covering the construction period from May 1902 through the fair final days in December 1904. Researchers working on the history of the exposition have consulted them extensively for the construction data they contain. Several pages in Volume 14, covering the period from August through October of 1903, have received less attention than the surrounding material, and it is those pages that concern this account. In the third week of August 1903, a crew working on the deep foundation excavation for the Varied Industries building broke through what Wainscott log described as an unexpected void space at a depth of approximately 22 feet below grade. The Varied Industries building was one of the exposition's largest permanent-style structures, positioned on the central axis of the fairgrounds near what would become the Palace of Fine Arts. Breaking into void space was not unusual in itself. The karst features had been appearing regularly. What was unusual, as Wainscott noted in a log entry dated August 21, was that the void space was not a natural dissolution feature. It was rectangular. The crew foreman, a man named August Pieper, whose own brief notes survive in a different collection at the Missouri Historical Society, described the walls of the space as constructed, cut stone, fitted without mortar in a technique he had not previously encountered, with a regularity and precision that he said, in his notes, put him in mind of a treasury or a strong room. by which he meant a space that had been deliberately built to last and to hold. The space was too deep and too dark for the men who first broke through to assess it fully in the available light. Wainscott dispatched 2 men with lanterns the following morning. Their report, summarized in his log rather than recorded verbatim, described a chamber roughly 40 feet long and 18 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling that stood approximately 10 feet above the chamber stone floor at its highest point. The walls were constructed of the same closely fitted limestone as what had been visible from the excavation point. The floor was flat and smooth, worked to a surface that one of the men described, in the summary Wainscott recorded, as finer than any stone floor he had seen in a public building. The chamber was empty, or appeared to be empty. Wainscott log noted that the men had been inside for less than 10 minutes, and that their lanterns had not illuminated the far end of the space clearly enough to confirm what was there. There was also what the men had heard. Wainscott noted this separately from the physical description, in a way that suggests he was not certain how to categorize it. The 2 men with lanterns had both reported, independently and before speaking to each other about it, a sound from within the chamber. Wainscott described the sound as they had described it to him, a low, continuous, uniform tone, felt as much as heard, with no identifiable source in the chamber and no variation in pitch or volume across the duration of the men time inside. Wainscott wrote that he asked both men separately whether they believed the sound was coming from the ground itself, from the walls, or from the air of the space, and that both men separately told him they could not determine its source because the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere inside the chamber equally, which was not how sounds normally behaved. He wrote these observations down. He then noted that he would obtain an engineering assessment and report to the exposition chief planner. The engineering assessment was conducted by a firm retained by the exposition authority. The firm name appears in exposition records and other contexts, but does not appear in connection with this assessment in any document that has been located. What Wainscott log records is the outcome. A memorandum from the exposition chief engineer, dated September 3, 1903, directing that the chamber be sealed and the foundation work proceed above it. The memorandum gave as its reason for sealing, rather than excavating, the schedule pressure of the approaching construction deadline, noting that the foundation work for the Varied Industries building was already running behind the timeline required for completion before the fair opening, and that the chamber did not represent a structural hazard sufficient to require its removal. Wainscott noted receipt of the memorandum and recorded the sealing in his log on September 9. Concrete poured over the breach point. Surface graded. Work continued. He also noted, in a single sentence that does not elaborate and is not followed up in subsequent log entries, that the concrete crew reported that the sound continued to be audible through the breach for the first hour of pouring, diminishing as the concrete depth increased, and was no longer detectable once the breach was fully sealed. He did not comment on what this implied about the sound origin. He moved on to the next day work. The Varied Industries building was completed on schedule and opened with the rest of the fair in April 1904. It housed exhibits of industrial machinery and manufactured goods from countries and companies around the world, and it was one of the most heavily visited exhibition spaces during the fair run. Nearly 20 million people walked the fairgrounds above and around the sealed chamber over those 7 months, none of them aware of what was beneath them, and none of Wainscott entries in Volume 14 having attracted attention sufficient to change this. The fair closed in December 1904, and the exhibition buildings were demolished in 1905, most of them having been built of a plaster composite called staff that was never intended to survive beyond the fair run. Forest Park was restored as a public park. The Varied Industries building came down. The ground above the sealed chamber was returned to park use. The Missouri Historical Society collection has been the subject of multiple research projects over the decades since the fair centenary in 2004, which produced a significant revival of academic and popular interest in the exposition history. None of the centenary research projects focused specifically on the construction logs in the way that would have brought Volume 14 August and September entries to prominence, because the research questions being asked in 2004 were primarily concerned with the fair cultural and social history, its racial exhibitions, its food history, its role in American imperial self-presentation. The entries concerning the chamber were first flagged by an archivist conducting a routine inventory of the Wainscott collection in 2011, who noted them in an internal memo as potentially of interest to researchers studying the karst geology of Forest Park. The memo was filed. No researcher followed up on it for several years. To understand what the chamber might have been requires knowing something about who occupied the land that became Forest Park before it became a park, and before it became the fairgrounds, and before it became St. Louis in any formal sense. The city was incorporated in 1822, but the land had been occupied continuously for much longer. The Mississippian culture, which built Cahokia directly across the river from what would become St. Louis, had settlements and satellite communities on the Missouri side of the river as well. Cahokia, at its height around 1050 to 1150 C, was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, with a population estimated at 10 to 20,000 people and a built environment that included a central mound larger at its base than the Great Pyramid at Giza. The archaeology of what is now the St. Louis metropolitan area has produced Mississippian material wherever the ground has been opened and examined carefully enough. The Mississippians worked stone. They built substantial structures. They constructed earthworks of a complexity that required engineering knowledge and organized labor at a scale that 19th century scholars consistently underestimated because the scale did not fit the developmental categories available to them. Whether a stone chamber of the dimensions Wainscott described, at 22 feet below the 1903 grade of Forest Park, could plausibly be attributed to Mississippian construction is a question that the archaeological record does not straightforwardly answer, because the archaeological record of the Forest Park area has never been systematically examined. The park history as continuous public green space has protected it from the development excavations that have produced Mississippian finds elsewhere in the metropolitan area. And park maintenance work does not typically reach the depths at which a pre-Columbian structure would be found. The chamber Wainscott described would sit below the depth of any maintenance excavation conducted in Forest Park in the century since the fair. It is, if it is still there, completely undisturbed. There is also the question of what lay between the karst bedrock and the chamber floor, which Wainscott log does not address, because his men did not investigate it. The karst formation underlying Forest Park includes documented cave systems in other parts of St. Louis that have been mapped at various points during the city history and that descend, in some cases, well below the 22-foot depth at which the construction crew reached the chamber. If the chamber was built above a deeper cave system, if it was placed at that specific depth deliberately as an antechamber or access point for something below it, then the sound the men reported hearing might have been traveling upward from a greater depth, channeled by the acoustic properties of the stone into the chamber where it arrived distributed and omnidirectional in exactly the way the men described. A stone funnel for a sound whose source lay further down than the chamber itself. The sound is the hardest part of this account to address responsibly, not because it is inherently more improbable than the chamber itself, but because it is the most vulnerable to the range of prosaic explanations that present themselves readily. Underground water movement in a karst system, resonance effects in an enclosed stone space amplifying vibrations from above or below. The particular acoustic properties of fitted limestone, creating the impression of omnidirectional sound from a source that was actually localized. These are real possibilities. They deserve to sit alongside the other real possibility, which is that the men who went into the chamber and independently described the same experience were accurately describing what they found, and that what they found was a stone space of considerable age and unknown original purpose that was producing, or transmitting, or in some way associated with a continuous low-frequency tone that diminished as concrete was poured over the point of entry and ceased when the entry was sealed. Low-frequency sound produced by geological processes is a documented phenomenon. The Earth generates infrasound through seismic activity, through the movement of deep water, and through resonance effects associated with specific geological formations. In karst terrain, the movement of water through underground channels can produce vibrations that, in the right geometrical relationship to enclosed stone spaces, become audible as tones. The Mississippi Valley is seismically active, a fact the New Madrid earthquake zone makes difficult to ignore. A stone chamber at depth in a karst formation in a seismically active river valley might genuinely produce or concentrate a continuous tone under certain geological conditions. This is not sufficient explanation for what Wainscott recorded, because the geological specifics necessary to support it are not available. It is enough to make the account plausible without requiring anything beyond the physical world. It is not enough to close the question. The Varied Industries building site is now occupied by the St. Louis Art Museum, which was the only exposition building constructed of permanent materials and intended from the outset to survive the fair. The museum sits in the eastern portion of Forest Park, on the central axis of what was the fairground. The ground beneath it has not been excavated since the museum original construction in 1903 and 1904. Wainscott's sealed chamber, if it exists where his log records it, sits somewhere within the footprint of the current museum complex, at 22 feet below what was the 1903 grade, under the concrete pour of September 9th, 1903, which hardened while the sound was still coming through, and then silenced it. The museum basement does not reach that depth. Between the lowest accessible floor and the chamber, if it is there, there is limestone and clay, and 120 years of accumulated quiet above whatever was making that tone before anyone poured concrete over the opening and moved on to the next day work. No one has listened for it since, whether the conditions that produced it are still present, whether the tone has continued in the sealed dark without a space open enough to carry it upward, whether it would be audible if the concrete were removed. These are questions the available evidence does not answer, and that the physical arrangement of things beneath Forest Park makes very difficult to ask with any precision greater than this. The question of why the chamber was sealed rather than studied deserves more attention than Wainscott log gives it. A stone chamber of that size, at that depth, and karst terrain, is not structurally neutral. Depending on its condition and the integrity of the surrounding stone, it could represent either a stable feature, with no effect on the foundations above, or an unstable one that could compromise them over time. The memorandum from the exposition chief engineer described the chamber as not representing a sufficient hazard to require removal, but it did not describe it as structurally sound enough to be confidently left open beneath a major building. The decision to pour concrete into the breach, rather than investigate what had been found, was a decision made in a hurry, under schedule pressure, by someone who appears to have wanted the question to go away, rather than to be answered. This is not an unusual thing to want. The St. Louis World Fair was a vast logistical enterprise, with a fixed opening date, substantial financial obligations, and the reputational stakes of a city that had spent years arguing it deserved to host the celebration of the Louisiana Purchase Centenary against competing bids from Chicago and Washington. A discovery that required halting foundation work, calling in archaeologists, navigating whatever legal and institutional complexity accompanied the finding of a pre-Columbian stone structure beneath a major public construction project in 1903, This was not a discovery anyone with responsibility for keeping the construction on schedule was equipped to welcome. The concrete was the answer a schedule-driven institution reaches for when the alternative is a question it does not have time to ask. Wayne Scott himself seems to have understood this. His log entries from the weeks following the sealing are notably terse, even by the standard of his usual economy of expression. He recorded the concrete pour, the surface grading, the resumption of foundation work, and then moved forward with the compressed efficiency of someone who has decided that a thing is settled and does not intend to revisit it. The single sentence about the sound diminishing as the concrete rose is the only moment in those subsequent weeks where something other than logistics enters his log. He placed it in the record with the same flat factuality he used for material quantities and workforce numbers, and then left it there without returning to it. It is the sentence of a man who felt, correctly, that what he was recording was strange, and who had decided that his job was to record it rather than to understand it, and that understanding it was someone else's problem in some future time when someone else was asking. The fair itself is remembered now primarily through a handful of images and a handful of foods. The ice cream cone allegedly invented at the fair, the hot dog bun, allegedly introduced there. The city that spent 7 months in 1904 as the center of the world attention, and then returned to being St. Louis. Forest Park is a beautiful and well-maintained park used daily by residents for running and cycling and picnicking. The St. Louis Art Museum is one of the better regional art museums in the country, housed in the neoclassical building that was the Fair Palace of Fine Arts. Neither the park nor the museum marks the location of the sealed chamber, because the sealed chamber is not part of any narrative either institution maintains about itself, and because the only person who recorded where it was left that record in 23 volumes of construction logs that have received less attention than the surrounding material. The chamber, if Wayne Scott description is accurate, and the concrete pour has held for 120 years, is 22 feet below the museum, in the dark, in the karst, above whatever is below it.